Molly Malone was a sullen girl with a thin, gaunt face and gray eyes that sunk straight back to the back of her head. She worked in an old, dusty bookstore. The store had once been owned by a man with fat jowls, whose eyes glistened with love for every book in the shop. He would tower like a guard between the precious books and any patron who didn't display the same look. Each book was filled with words that had been worried over by some writer, alternately full of pride or self-conscious terror. A book, after all, if passed along wisely, would travel the ages. He liked to think of his books as future antiques, sitting next to a bed in some place man had carved out of the vacuum in 1,000 years. To ensure his immortality among his progeny, he had spent great care designing fine marble nameplates on which was embossed the date, the name of the shop, and his own name in the most beautiful classic font that he had been able to haunt out. He did believe that the little things that marked the passage of the books through time added to their value, just as his filled-out jowls and fine creases marked him as someone whose life had been lived and was full of stories. The Japanese did the same, each owner adding the imprint of a seal to a great painting that had come into their possession. Long after their bones were clean, each time one of the great works they had owned was admired anew, they would live on a bit longer. Collecting of great works was deadly serious. It was the way to immortality. When he was alive, he had been the only one that had been able to crack Molly's gaunt face, give her an almost smile that didn't keep her from being sullen, but for just a little while had added a touch of soft. She did not notice it until he was gone, and the softness in her mixed into the dirt that covered him. Molly lived on a narrow street filled with gray buildings that enclosed around her like it was a path in a dense forest. Her neighbors hid behind their shutters, peeking out but never wanting anyone to look in. Trash cans lined the street, constantly knocked over by the animals scavenging to keep themselves alive. As she walked home from the shop, they would scatter back to their hiding holes as she got too close. One night during her walk home, a dog caught her eye as she got to the front of the place she lived. The dog's face was thin and gaunt, and he lingered over the trash can he had been rooting through for just a moment longer than was safe. He cocked his head to the side as their eyes locked. It was the strangest thing. She thought a moment of understanding had passed between them, but in the next instant he turned and trotted off down the street and disappeared. When she came back the next day, she fully expected he would be there waiting for her, and almost cried from the disappointment when he wasn't. She looked for him again and again, each night as she came home, but nothing. Finally, she left a bone, wrapped in a butcher's white paper next to the trash can where she had first seen him. When she came out 10 minutes later, the whole package was gone. She knew that more than likely one of the other animals had taken it, but she chose to think of him, safe in his hiding den somewhere, chewing happily away. The thought brought a little softness back. The next morning, she stumbled over something on her way out the door. She looked down to see the white butcher paper torn open and with a very chewed-up raggedy doll inside. The doll was dried and chewed and sticky wet on one side. During her lunch, she took it and washed it and dried it and fluffed it up. On the way home, she stopped by and got another butcher pack filled with bits of meat. That night, she slept holding the raggedy doll. In the morning, she found the paper filled with a bit of gnawed-on rope. And so it went. Her little apartment started to fill with junk treasures, and each night she would sleep holding the raggedy doll close. She kept looking for the dog, expecting one day to turn around and see him following her, or to come home and find him waiting at the steps. She worried about him, out there alone in the world of dangers. But each morning as she found her paper-wrapped present, she knew he had survived another night, and that made her happy. One night as she walked home with that night's white package tucked under her arm, she heard a quiet noise behind her. Her heart leaped at the thought of finally seeing her friend again, but as she started to turn and look, she felt a hand slam into the middle of her back and she fell forward. Her face slammed into the concrete and her jaw started to burn as she felt her attacker's weight on the back of her knees. One of his hands was pinning her down by her neck, and the other was tearing at the waist of her skirt. She had trouble catching her breath as she realized what was going to happen to her. She heard a low rumbling sound, and the weight on top of her stopped moving for an instant. Then there was movement, fast movement, and the weight on top of her wasn't there anymore. She heard sounds of quick movements and that low, terrible sound. She could just see movement out of the corner of her eye, but was still too terrified to move. She heard a final rumble and then the sounds of footsteps running. Something wet and sticky slid across her exposed cheek. It was him. As she rolled over, he kept licking her face, and she put her arms around him. It wasn't till later, when she had cleaned him up and he was lying heavy on her legs in her bed, that she noticed. All the feeding she had given him had filled him out quite nicely. She scratched him under the chin and gave him a long, soft stroke across his nice, fat jowls.